I'm really, really happy to present to all of you Javier Ideami, who is our guest speaker for today. He's basically one of the most hyperactive people that I know. He's done stuff with music. He's an engineer. He's a thinker. He's a researcher, an artist, an entrepreneur. He's done projects in Silicon Valley, in the middle of the jungle. He helped us with our augmented reality glasses project, worked in a variety of centers from Stanford, UC Berkeley, and the United Nations. And on top of that, I think 2 years ago, I was very surprised because I saw Javier's name pop up on the newsfeed, and it turned out that he had done a project on deep learning and the lost landscape, which was the field that I decided to choose after we met in Silicon Valley. On top of that, I have to say, personally for me, I'm really happy to host Javi today now as a teacher, but I was once his student, right? So I very much feel the pressure that you feel today with the demo and the Strive and everything. I have to say I've been through this process several times, and part of the beauty of it, or the things that I've learned in terms of my teaching, was also seeing how Javier, how Xavier Verdaguer as well pushed us, and every single one of us, when we did a disruptive innovation program in Silicon Valley, right? Which was very much with the same intensity that you do today, with probably a little bit less of sleep, because it so happens that because Javier and Xavier don't need to sleep much, they also push all the other people not to sleep so much. But we did an augmented reality glasses project, and they were instrumental on these first steps that later led me on to choosing my journey on technology. So I'm very happy to be tying the circle today, and as a teacher, being able to host Javier and making sure that his teachings and the things that he's doing are spread around among another set of people. So without much hesitation, I think, Javier, I can leave the floor to you to present. And yeah, if you want to introduce yourself very briefly on. I know we could spend a lot of time talking about all the projects that you have done, because you've done a lot, but I think you come here with a particular project in mind to show all of us.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. I mean, it is, thank you, and hello, everybody. It's very exciting to be here, and I'm super excited, especially to be here with Jan, because you brought me now these beautiful memories of when we met in California in the amazing program of Imagine Creativity Center with Xavi Verdaguer and all his team. We had an incredible time, and there I discovered the tremendous talent that you have, Jan, and you have done incredible things, and you are doing amazing things. So really, I'm very excited also for all that you're doing. So thank you for the introduction, and let's go with the presentation. So, all right, welcome everybody from Flatland to the trillion-dimensional space. This is the presentation. We're going to do a journey together. Let's go for it. So, who is this? This is not Jeff Hinton. This is not Joshua Bengio or Jan LeCun. No, this is Christopher Columbus. Why? Okay, so Christopher Columbus, right? When he was searching for America, traveling through the oceans in these primitive ships, dealing with the frustration and the uncertainty, navigating this three-dimensional space. But if we flatten the Earth, we could say this is like a really two-dimensional surface. So navigating this two-dimensional surface, dealing with the uncertainty, looking for the right combination of the coordinates that would take him and his team to the treasure, to the objective that was finding America. And in the same way, when we train our neural networks, we are also navigating through the frustration and the uncertainty as we combine all the hyperparameters and all the different architectures that we use, and all the different values of those millions, billions, and soon trillions of weights of our networks. And in combination with our loss functions, as we measure the performance, as we measure the difference between what we obtain and what we are searching for. We are navigating these spaces, but not moving in 2 or 3 directions, moving in millions, billions, and trillions of directions. So in this presentation, we are all going to do a journey like Christopher Columbus, searching for that small lost value, searching for that valley, searching and navigating through the geometry of that lost surface that comes from the combination of those billions or trillions of weights. And for that, I'm going to speak about the Lost Landscape project. And I'm going to give you a bit the context of the project. Then I'm going to speak about the dynamics of these landscapes in movement. Then I'm going to show you examples and describe you what we are seeing, the examples. And finally, I will end by presenting the very recently released Lost Landscape Explorer app that I just released recently, and that allows you to interact a bit with these landscapes online. All right, let's go for it. Well, Jan has already presented my background, so let's go for it. So as you and all of us train our neural networks, right, we are looking again for that combination of the millions, billions, or trillions of parameters, and we are measuring the performance with what we call the loss function, that measures the difference between what we are obtaining and what we want to obtain. And that loss function depends on all of those millions, billions, or trillions of weights. Therefore, this function is very high dimensional and non-linear. And we can use different types of loss functions to measure the performance of the network, to measure the error, the difference between what we obtain and what we want to obtain. We may use, depending if we're doing regression, classification, we're working with GANs, we may use cross entropy, etc., etc. But all of these functions have the same objective: to push those weights, to push that navigation in the direction that is going to decrease that loss value, that is going to help us navigate down that surface towards the valley, towards the right minima. And of course, they all do it in different ways depending on the constraints and the requirements of the specific system. But again, we are not navigating the oceans like Christopher Columbus in 2D or 3D. We are navigating billions or trillions of dimensions. So it is very, very important that because we're dealing with the same uncertainty and frustration that Columbus was dealing with. So we need to understand as well as possible the geometry of that surface. And for that, numerical analysis and visualization are a team, are partners. They complement each other in that task. And together, working together, numerical analysis and visualization, they can help us through better understanding that lost surface. They can help us improve our understanding of how generalization works, why it happens, and improve our architectures and our algorithms. And we all understand the importance of visualization, because it gives us a perspective that is very, very different and unique, yet complementary to what numerical analysis gives us. But it's very different and unique. That's why, for example, Albert Einstein, when he was searching for insights, he used to mainly work with visualization. He would use numerical analysis and language later on, when he had to, refine his discoveries. But most of his work was based on visualization. He was, for example, imagining that he was a photon traveling through space. One of the many visualizations he used to get to his theory of relativity. And on the right, we see the first picture of a black hole that was released recently, and that one day it may eventually, who knows, earn a Nobel Prize. Both of these visualizations are big simplifications of the underlying complexity and reality. And yet they are so important. Why? Because when we are dealing with space that is so complex, that is so far away, so far away from us, so unreachable as these spaces with billions and trillions of dimensions, even a simple cross-section of that complexity can potentially take us to important insights. But we must always ask ourselves one very important question. Are these visualizations capturing enough rigor, enough useful and actionable data? We must ask always this question in regards to the picture of the black hole, in regards to the imagination of Einstein, and in regards to these representations that we will see today of the lost landscapes. And we will see that the answer is yes, and we will explain it in a little bit. So the challenge that we have is that we want to complement numerical analysis by also creating visualizations of the geometry of the lost surfaces. The lost surfaces that combine these very high dimensional spaces of the weights of the neural networks and the loss values that are calculated with the loss function. But we cannot visualize a billion dimensions. We can only visualize 3. So what are we going to do? We are going to have to use tricks. We're going to have to use dimensionality reduction techniques to reduce the dimensionality and study cross-sections of that complexity. That's what we are going to do. And in the last years, researchers have been progressively creating 1D plots, 2D plots, 3D plots of these cross-sections. One of my favorite papers is by Tom Goldstein's team, presented in NeurIPS 2018, an absolute reference in this area. I'm really fan of this paper. And so, what the Lost Landscape project that I began is trying to do is to take these visualizations onto greater and greater detail, and also to study them, not just static, but also in movement, to analyze their dynamics in movement, and also to add all the creative aspect to it. And the creative aspect is not just about making them look nice, because people say, hey, they look nice, but it's more than that, right? For example, here on the right, on the left, we see a raw picture of a galaxy captured by astronomers, and on the right, the same picture post-produced. This is what people typically see. Now, the one on the right is not only more beautiful, it also helps us understand better what we see. It also helps us reflect better on what we see, and if we're going to find an insight from one of these two, it's probably going to be with the right one. So, there is more to the creative aspect than just, making it look nice. All right, so we're dealing with all of this complexity, and researchers have been finding a lot of connections between the geometry of these surfaces and these representations, these visualizations. For example, if you use skip connections in Resnets, you can see that the surface gets smoother, which correlates with a better training. Or if you train with stochastic gradient descent with SGD and small batch sizes, this tends to correlate with flatter minima, which tends to correlate with better generalization. Most researchers agree. And this is kind of intuitive, right? Because if you are using gradient descent and you reach a minima, and you are in a point in weight space in that minima, you have navigated the oceans of this billion dimensional space, and you get to a point there, okay? And if that minima is flatter, if it is quite flat, if you move a little bit around that point, because the loss value is not going to change too much because it's flatter, okay, it means that you are going to have a wider margin of safety. So if you think, for example, of the boundaries that separate in the input space your data, for example, there's going to be less risk of a bad result, of basically stepping onto the wrong data, whatever. All right, so they have been finding a lot of these connections. And so when you and when all of us train our networks and we get to different points in weight space, we don't want to be blind. We want to be able to look around. Okay, so we train the network, we get to a point in weight space, and we get a certain loss value. We get a certain performance. But it's very important to understand what happens around that point. What happens if you move a little bit? Because the data distribution that you have, when you use test data or whatever, the distribution is going to change. What happens when you're going to move a little bit in a different directions? How is the surface? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it full of non-convexities? What's going on? So we use different mathematical equations and procedures to navigate this space like Christopher Columbus was doing in the oceans. We can pick a point in weight space and interpolate in a random direction. Or we can pick a couple of points in weight space and go from one to the other, interpolating also, Or we can pick a couple of random directions in weight space that are orthogonal to each other, so they make a plane, and we can use that plane to slice the high dimensionality, project it onto that plane, and then calculate a series of loss values on a grid on that plane to build a surface. Or we could pick a couple of minima, a couple of points in weight space with low loss value, and search for a path, for a connection that links those 2 points, maintaining a very low loss value. This is very important because we used to think that when we train the networks, the minima that we reach were isolated from each other and separated by areas of very high loss value. But thanks to the work of researchers like the ones that I have collaborated with, and I will talk about later, we now talk about mode connectivity, being able to connect different minima, maintaining a low loss value in that connection. And so we are exploring, we are navigating the oceans of the high dimensionality like Christopher Columbus was doing. And we're exploring these cross sections of this hidden beauty. And in order to do these dimensionality reductions, in order to do these projections, we can do it in different ways. We can do different types of directions to slice that high dimensionality. For example, we can use PCA directions. These are the most optimized directions of the system down the gradient. And if we do that, we will be able to capture very well the variation in the trajectory of SGD, but we will not be able to capture well the richness of the surroundings of that most optimized parts of the landscape. Conversely, if we use random orthogonal directions, we will be able to capture pretty well the variation, the richness, the distribution of non-convexities and convexities that may exist around that point in general, but we will have problems to capture the variation in the trajectory of SGD. Why is this? Because it has been shown that the trajectory of SGD exists in a very low dimensional subspace. And because of the counterintuitive properties of very high dimensional spaces, if you pick a random direction, it is almost guaranteed that it's going to be orthogonal to the trajectory of SGD, so you are not going to be able to capture well the variation in the trajectory. So different directions are going to serve for different purposes. For the same counterintuitive properties of high dimensional spaces, if you pick a couple of random directions in very high dimensional space, it is almost guaranteed that they are gonna be orthogonal to each other, so you will be able to make a plane with them. And there is a very simple proof using the cosine similarity to demonstrate this. It's part of these counterintuitive properties of very high dimensional spaces that we're gonna have a lot of fun with in the rest of this talk. And finally, the last important thing to consider, when we slice the high dimensionality with these random directions, it is very important to normalize the directions. Why is this? Easy to understand. If we have a couple of minimizers with magnitude, one of them larger than one of them smaller than one, and we apply the same perturbation to both of unit 1, for example, and we build visualizations with that, what's going to happen? That in the visualization, we're going to see differences between both that are being caused by the lack of proportion or the different proportionality between the perturbation and the magnitude of each of the minimizers. And this can cause a lot of problems. This is an example from Tom Goldstein's team paper. If you have, for example, a minimizer built with small batch size and another one with large batch size, and you apply weight decay is going to be applied more often in the case of the small batch size because updates happen more often, so those weights are going to get smaller, and then you build the visualizations, and the minima that looked flatter before is going to look sharper after that, but the generalization is still going to be better. So again, what is happening? It's happening the same thing. Because you have not normalized the directions, you are seeing the lack of proportion, the wrong proportions between the perturbation and the magnitude of the weights. So to fix this is very easy. You just normalize these directions, and you can normalize because they have the same, the directions have the same structure, okay, of the weights of the network. So you can normalize by layer or by filter. By filter works very well. And if it is not a convnet, you can use equivalent structure to what would be the filter, etc., etc. And that's it. You normalize them, you apply the dimensionality reduction, and you build these surfaces. And now comes the question. Yes, the surface looks nice, looks interesting. We want to work with it, but are we capturing in these visualizations useful and actionable data? And the answer is yes, because researchers have demonstrated that the main curvatures of these dimensionality reduced plots are a weighted average of the main curvatures of the full dimensional surface. And what the researchers do is they use numerical analysis, they use the Hessian matrix of the second derivatives, and they use the eigenvalues, the extreme eigenvalues, the ratio of the extreme eigenvalues, and they build, for example, heat maps, and they study the distribution of non-convexities and convexities, and they compare them with the visualizations, and they see that they match. And specifically, if you see a non-convexity in these cross sections, it means that there is non-convexity in the high dimensional space. And if you see convexity, it does not mean that the high dimensional space is all positive curvature, but it means that the positive curvature is dominant. Okay? And so, in this way, just as with the photograph of the black hole, just as with the imagination of Einstein, we find that we have enough rigor, enough connection to that complexity to work with it and to chase new insights. And so we combine different architectures and parameters, and we build these visualizations, and now we arrive to the very fascinating topic of the dynamics, because we can build these visualizations static, but also in movement. And what happens is that as you study these landscapes through different steps and epochs, and as you transform those billion dimensions into 2 plus the loss 3, and you do that through the steps and the epochs, you begin to see very counterintuitive effects, shapes that appear out of nowhere, morphology shifts, tunneling. Why is this happening? And to understand that, we have to understand that in comparison with these very high dimensional spaces, we, all of us, are living and working in our own flatland reality. And there is a wonderful talk by mathematician Matt Parker at the Royal Institution called Four-Dimensional Maths, in which Matt shows us these wonderful videos in which, for example, we see a 3D cube moving through a 2D world. Let's play it. Yes. And we see how, from the perspective of the 3D world, everything is continuous, but from the perspective of the 2D world, a square appears out of nowhere and then disappears. This is the same thing falling through a corner, and it's even weirder. There's like a triangle that appears out of nowhere, it becomes a different shape, and then disappears. This is from the perspective of the flat land. From the perspective of the 3D world, everything is continuous. This is falling through the edge. There is a rectangle that expands, contracts, and disappears. Okay, and now we're gonna see the same thing on the right. This is the perspective from the flatland people. That in this case, in deep learning, is us. And now we're gonna see the simulation of a 4D object falling through a 3D world. And it gets even more complex and even crazier. So, in these representations in movement, a similar thing happens. We have a combination of billions or trillions of weights that establish a point in high-dimensional space. As we move through the steps and the epochs, every move is triggering a dimensionality reduction transformation, and this is analog to filter that high-dimensional space through our low-dimensional reality. The high-dimensional continuity remains, but those counterintuitive effects are caused by the act of filtering all of that through our low-dimensionality, through our flatland reality, as we progress through that space. There is also, by the way, the texture, the noise in the surface. There is the morphology noise, and this is easy to understand, like the skip connections or non-skip connections. As we change the hyperparameters and the architecture, this has an impact on the texture of the surface. And then we have the dynamic noise. As we move through the steps, there are things like the batch size that have an impact, because if you are capturing different steps, and in each step you are using a different part of the data set, of course this is going to have an impact as well on the dynamic texture, of the texture of the dynamics as well. And so we have seen in Matt's examples how, as we went higher in dimensionality, the counterintuitive effects got more complex. And we have all of these ones, and for example, tunneling is one of them. We are going to see in the examples that, for example, a landscape at the beginning of the training process, it may begin quite flat, and as we progress, there is this convexity that begins to tunnel down, to form. This does not mean that in the high dimensional space, something is making a convexity is making a hole there. Of course not. In the very high dimensional space, we are moving in billions and millions of directions. But as we filter that, as we pass it through our flatland filters, we see this counterintuitive tunneling effect. But what is fascinating is that we used to be very worried about getting stuck in local minima, the saddle points. But thanks to the work of the researchers with more connectivity, etc., and what we begin to learn with this type of visualizations and also with the numerical analysis work, we begin to understand that there is many ways of finding shortcuts in that high dimensionality. We connect more and more with this concept of the blessing of dimensionality versus the curse of dimensionality. This is a wonderful talk by Babak Hassibi, in which Babak tells us that when we initialize our networks well, the problem of finding a good minima goes from finding a needle in a haystack to exploring a haystack full of needles. In a way, finding that good minima becomes a local problem. And so, exploring these cross sections, we are also exploring that hidden beauty, that blessing of dimensionality. We are capturing these counterintuitive effects, and now we can take our time to try to infer what is going on up there. And in whatever dimensionality we work, we encompass the lower dimensions and we study cross sections of the higher dimensions. That's why, for example, in our three-dimensional reality, we see slices of time. If we could live in a higher dimension, maybe we would see time all at once. And so, we capture these cross sections in different ways, slicing the high dimensionality in different ways, even using extra factors to communicate more information, but they are all quite similar. And this pipeline, the pipeline of this project, combines, as Jan said, engineering aspects, programming aspects, optimization aspects, modeling aspects, creative aspects, production aspects, post-production aspects, etc., etc. And now we're going to see a 10-minute video with examples, and I'm going to be explaining you what we see. The first one is learning rate stress tests. Here I am using different learning rate schedules, very radical changes of learning rate, to study the resiliency of the surface. How much can we push the training process before we go to a part of the high dimensional space from which we cannot escape, where everything collapses, the transformation as well? What is the resilience of different networks and combinations when they are exposed to these radical changes? So this is the learning rate stress tests. And this is an example of the tunneling. We see also the tunneling there, how it goes down towards a minima. And now we go to mode connectivity. This is a wonderful paper, a collaboration with NYU and MIT researchers, Timur Garipov, Pavel Ismailov, Dmitry Podobryhin, Dmitry Vetrov, and Andrew Gordon Wilson. And what these researchers do is fascinating. They reach, for example, three minimizers, three minima in weight space, and 3 points make a plane. All right? So they take two of those points, two of those minima, and they rotate that plane around all the high dimensionality until they find a path. Until they find a path. Oops, I have again here. That connects those points, maintaining a very low loss value. And that type of path could be a Bezier curve, it could be a polygonal path. Typically it's not a straight line. All right? And what is fascinating, as we will see now in the representation, is that when we capture this in movement, we can see how the barrier that separates the minima melts. It's like it dissolves and gradually connects the two minima. Again, this does not mean that in the high dimensional space something is melting between the minima. It means that as we filter those movements in billions of dimensions through our Flatland filters, we see this counterintuitive melting of the barrier. And we find the path, the connection that allows us to go from one minima to another minima, maintaining a very low loss value. But notice that the direct connection between the minima still has a very high loss value. Okay, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. So this is mode connectivity, and this is a static representation of the same in very high resolution. We can see the contrast between the rough geometry of the higher loss part of the landscape and the smoother one that connects the minima. This is a zenithal view of the connection between the minima. This is a very dramatic view of the very rough geometry in the parts of the landscape that have high loss value. Now we get to the cathedral, one of my favorites, in which I call it the cathedral. And we can see this dramatic contrast between both parts. That's it. And these are studies. Okay, in the studies, what I'm doing in the studies is to capture with different combinations of hyperparameters and architectures, specific parts of the landscape that I am interested in, and compare them, etc., etc., etc. Changing dropout, batch norm, etc., etc. This is, for example, with Resnets, using non-skip connections, using skip connections, and studying the changes in morphology and the dynamics in movement as well of the networks. This is the Lost Landscape Library project, an ongoing project that is different from the Explorer app. This is about providing a detailed view of the impact of very low granularity changes of hyperparameters on the geometry of the surface. And this is an ongoing project, more complex than the Lost Landscape Explorer app, and it is ongoing. And now we go to the collaborations with the Landscape Deep Learning Research Group, founded by Diganta Misra, who just joined Weights and Biases. Okay, this is a collaboration about the Mish activation function created by Diganta Misra, a non-monotonic smooth activation function which preserves a small amount of negative weights. And what we do in this project is to compare the loss surfaces of different activation functions, specifically ReLU, Swish, and Mish. And we capture the landscapes on the 200th epoch of the training of a ResNet 20 network. And we compare the loss surfaces, how well conditioned they are, what are the properties, and basically the conditioning of the minima itself. We compare them, we see, for example, the better behavior and the better conditioning of Mish compared to ReLU, for example. And this is one of the examples of the collaborations that I do with the Landscape with K Research Group. All right. And now we go to the Lottery Garden. This is a project based on the lottery ticket hypothesis paper by Jonathan Frankel and Michael Carvin, in which I prune the weights of the network. I begin to basically cut the weights, the smallest ones first. I get rid of them. And what is really fascinating is that as you get rid of the weights, the smallest ones first, the performance of the network, when you prune up to 40 or 50%, it can even improve. Only when you get to 80 or 90%, the performance begins to really suffer until it completely collapses. So there is a subset of the weights of the network when you train a network that is really responsible for the performance, and you can get rid of most of the weights and still preserve most of the performance. What breaks through the plane is improving here the performance of the fully trained network. And we can say up to 40-50%, it's really improving. And the behavior of the surface is really nice behaved, again, up to 40, 50, 60%. And when it reaches 80, 90%, it begins to suffer until it completely collapses. Here we see it in movement. As we reach 20%, 30% of pruning, 40%, sometimes it exceeds. I am capturing, by the way, 6 different epochs here, okay? And we see as we reach 80%, 90%, it begins to be unable to tunnel down until where the fully trained network reached, until it collapses. Okay, edge horizon and downfall. These are names that I give to different parts of the landscapes that I am interested in as I work with them. So I call the edge horizon to the transition to the main convexity of the landscape, and the downfall, the transition from the edge horizon to the bottom of the minima. And then, of course, we have the minima. And this is a very interesting paper by researchers, PI Hessian, in which, for example, they say that we used to think that batch normalization made the surface smoother, but they say, but in certain combinations, for example, of depth, the opposite happens. And this is the same thing that I find in many of my experiments. That is very difficult. It takes a long time because sometimes you find the correlation, and then you may find variations with different combinations of parameters and a different behavior. Okay, this is a very high resolution capture of an edge horizon, and we see using the creative aspect of the project to enhance the morphology that we're studying. This is a soft, slow capture of the process of tunneling down towards the convexity. This is the transition from the top of an edge horizon to the bottom of the minima, and studying the bottom of the minima, the dynamics in movement, which is also very, very interesting. All right, now we go to, this is an overview. This is a flyby over an edge horizon. And this is one of my favorites. This is one of the first ones I created. And we can see here again the process of tunneling. Yeah, I love this one. It's one of the first ones I captured. And we can see there the beginning of that tunneling process seen from below. All right, this is another static capture in high resolution of an edge horizon, high resolution of a downfall in here, other captures of, and very important, I have to tell you something very important, by the way, for you to understand what we are really seeing here. This is very important. In the center of the landscape, in the center of the visualization, what you have is the current position of your minimizer, okay? Your current position in weight space is the center of the plane that you are using to slice the high dimensionality. So the very center is where the minimizer is. And then we interpolate, we basically interpolate across that plane on a certain range that we can choose. So what you are seeing around in the rest of the landscape is basically a range. So you are at the center of the plane and you are looking around that point on a certain range that you choose. And as we capture this in movement, you have to think that every time you move to a new point in the very high dimensional space, we do the same thing. So in a way, metaphorically speaking, okay, it is as if we were riding on the shoulders of the minimizer. Okay, it's as if the minimizer is navigating like Columbus, the oceans of the billion dimensional space, and we are riding on the shoulders of the minimizer, and we are looking around. We have like a torch, okay, like a torch, no pun intended, Ideami. Okay, so we have a torch and we are like illuminating a certain range around us. We are riding on the shoulders of the minimizer and we're illuminating a certain range around us as we move on the shoulders of that minimizer. Okay, that's what we're doing. Now we go to dropout, fascinating. As we begin to increase the dropout, as we train, of course, in the training phase of the network, there is this homogeneous layer of noise that begins to take over the landscape, and this is a layer of noise that is disruptive enough to prevent too much overfitting, too much memorization of the paths in the high dimensional space, but not disruptive enough to prevent the network from converging to a good solution unless we go too crazy with the dropout. And of course, if we increase dropout too much, then of course we're going to prevent the network from the process from converging to a good solution, of course. And this is the same thing in minima. We're increasing gradually the dropout and seeing the effect. Okay, this is Bayesian deep learning, a wonderful paper again by colleagues of MIT and NYU, Wesley Maddox, Timur Garipov, Pavel Ismailov, Dmitry Vetrov, and Andrew Gordon Wilson. And Bayesian deep learning is all about dealing with uncertainty so that we don't do overconfident predictions in deep learning. And what these researchers do is what? Well, they want to build a probability distribution of the weights of the network that they call the posterior, but that is very difficult, that is intractable. So they approximated, and they approximated using the trajectory of SGD. So they train the network, they get to a good minima, okay? And once they get to a good minima, they use a high learning rate to explore other parts of that minima to capture a set of other solutions that are around that point in the minima. And with that set, they build a Gaussian distribution, and they demonstrate that that Gaussian distribution built with that set of points in the minima explains well the geometry of the loss surface. And in this visualization, we represent the landscape created with real data and PCA directions and the real positions of the different points in the minima that they capture, different solutions, and also the Gaussian distribution that was created from that. Yes, that was a very interesting project. Presented in NeurIPS 2019. The other one was presented mode connectivity in NeurIPS 2018. All right, now we go to the GANs, the wild networks. And we all know what is the problem with the GANs. that typically the loss function does not correlate well, the values, with the performance of, for example, the generator and the images, etc. But if we use a type of GAN called the Wasserstein GAN with gradient penalty that uses a different type of loss function based on the Earth's mover distance, that is shortest distance to move a probability mass from a distribution to another. And this loss function, yes, the values correlate better with performance, and then we can study the dynamics of, for example, the generator, and we can really capture that more uncertain, more harder to manage nature of these networks in this specific example using the Zeliba dataset. This is a collaboration with Swiss company Neural Concept about geometric deep learning, in which they try to predict the aerodynamic properties of an aircraft, of a drone, the pressure exerted by the head on the surface of the drone, and we also can capture the features learned by the filters, which typically we would visualize as a 2D image in a typical CompNet, but because this is a geometric 3D CompNet, we can then map that directly on the surface of the 3D drone. And that's it. And finally, to conclude, this is the Lost Landscape Explorer app that I released a few days ago. This is an interactive, free, open app that you can access, and it allows you to visualize some of these landscapes produced with dimensionality reduction techniques and real data, and you can interact with them, and you can, for example, use the auto descent mode to simulate a descent through the gradient of the surface. Of course, you are not descending through the high dimensional surface, okay? You are descending through the dimensionality reduced surface. And you can click anywhere on the landscape and simulate these gradient descent processes. And it's very interesting because, for example, it's useful for educational purposes and also for research. For example, you can see how you begin a descent and you may get trapped on a local minima, and then you have a control to manipulate in real time what you would call the learning rate or the descent rate, and then you can increase it and you can escape from the local minima doing that, blah, blah, and you can study different strategies with that. Or for example, you can get to a minima, and when the gradient gets very, very small, almost zero, the point stops practically. But if you increase the learning rate, then you can explore the minima and get to other solutions inside that minima. And that is what, for example, the Bayesian researchers were doing. So you can use this to explore different research strategies. And you can also draw on top of the landscape. You can also capture PNG snapshots of different views. You can study the gradients. You can do a lot of different things. And I programmed this with React and WebGL, so you don't have to install anything. You can access it from any device. And yeah, I will be adding new features in next releases. But it is available at the moment at lostlandscape.com/explorer. Yes, indeed. And that is going to conclude, if I don't forget. I think this is the end of the presentation. Yeah, if you want to see any more of my work, of course, you can visit ideami.com. And with this, thank you for listening.